Hello everyone, hi! So in this video I'm gonna talk about everything that I had to read in my first year of being a literature student. I study comparative literature at the University of Vienna, and last week I already posted a video about the first half of my courses and all the things I had to read for those. I'll link that video up here. And today I'm gonna cover the other half of my courses, which are 1. The Provocative Spirit of Literature, the Classics and their Controversies. 2. A course called The Spectres of Postmodern Writing. 3. My Norwegian language course. 4. Thematology. And 5. A course called The Colonial Past and Post-Colonial Present of the Low Countries Reflected in Literature. If you're new to this channel, then hello and welcome. My name is Maria. As I already said, I study literature, and that's mostly what I make videos about here on this channel. In fact, I have an entire playlist just called Studying Literature. I can link that up here if you're interested. And if you're enjoying these videos, please consider subscribing and supporting the channel. I link my coffee count in the description down below. And now let's get into it. In my video last week, I made a bunch of disclaimers at the beginning, and I'm not gonna repeat all of them entirely here. I'm somewhat assuming that you have seen last week's video if you're watching this part 2, but I'll just sum them up in one sentence each to give you a little reminder. So first of all, those are the courses that I have chosen, and they're an example of what one can study when deciding to study literature, but they're not an all-encompassing representation by any means. Secondly, please excuse me for mispronouncing some names and titles. If I do, I'm not doing it on purpose, but the sheer amount of titles mentioned makes it very likely that I'm gonna misspeak at some point. Number 3, I'll try to be specific with how much I had to read from these books and articles that I'm about to mention. Just know that I very rarely had to read entire books. Me listing all of these sources here is really just so that you can have a list you can run with in case you're interested in any of these topics. And the last disclaimer I gave was that, just reading all these books on the list does not equal an education in literature. And while that would be great, you'll probably miss the professor's input and curation, which is really important in my opinion and is a great value of studying literature. Okay, now with all those disclaimers out of the way, let's get into the first course, which is called The Provocative Spirit of Literature, the Classics and their Controversies. So in this course, we looked at important texts throughout history that went beyond what was perceived normal at the time. So there are texts that were scandalous or simply provocative at the time that they were published. In combination with that, all the writers on the list also had their very own theories on what literature is and is supposed to do or supposed to be like. And they have a very distinct idea of the role that they attribute to reading and writing. So yeah, this was a class on literary theory, and let's get into the sources now. So the first source we looked at was Plato's stance on literature in his Politeia. He basically said that literature, as opposed to philosophy, doesn't tell the truth, and he would therefore, in his ideal state, ban all poets. Many centuries later, Nietzsche called Plato the greatest enemy of art that Europe has ever seen because of his stance on literature. So in class, we looked at how Plato argued for his ideal state, especially with regards to literature, and most of that can be found in books 3 and 10, in case you want to read up on it. It really struck me how relevant this discussion seems to me. Yeah, it was just intriguing to think about whether I agree with Plato that literature makes the mind unstable and brings it away from a state of calmness and equanimity. But on the other hand, of course, he loved literature. You know, he himself often used allegories and metaphors to describe and substantiate his ideas. And he loved reading Homer. He admitted that. But what he didn't like about Homer was how imperfect the gods were described. You know, they had flaws, they had desires. So he sacrificed his love for literature, for Homer in this case, to live a grounded and balanced life. The second source for this course was Aristotle's Poetics. I, for the life of me, cannot find the book. I know it has to be somewhere behind me, but I literally stood in front of my bookshelf for 10 minutes. I couldn't find it. But anyways, in the Poetics, Aristotle tries to give an answer to Plato, and Aristotle argues for literature, saying that literature does have worth because it is cathartic and therefore cleansing, you know. Whatever we read about, we don't have to do ourselves because we can live vicariously through the characters and are thereby vaccinated against having to do the same thing in our life. So this book, The Poetics, which I cannot show you because I don't know where it is, it explores those central themes of nemesis and catharsis. And it is just a very fundamental book, the earliest we have actually on literary theory. You know, the first written record that we have of someone sitting down and thinking about what literature is supposed to do, how to categorize different texts, etc. And now my notes say read a quote, but I can't. I'm sorry. I'll have to skip over that. Anyways, then let's move on with the list of sources for this course. We also looked at Aristotle's Metaphysics, Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, an article by Sigmund Freud, which was called Dostoevsky and Parasite. Parricide. I think that is the act of killing your own father. So what I was actually trying to say is, in the course, we also read quite a few quotes from different texts by Sigmund Freud, amongst which The Analysis of Dreams, Creative Writers and Daydreaming, Totem and Taboo, because Freud also mentions the idea of catharsis, and Freud loved and defended literature, actually. He said that you can see much of the human unconscious in what is written in literature, and he used a lot of books to substantiate his ideas of psychoanalysis. His favorite books famously were the Oedipus myth, of course, Hamlet by Shakespeare, and the brothers Karamazov. And the article that he wrote on Dostoevsky, it's pretty famous, and Freud argues that Dostoevsky, through writing the brothers Karamazov, worked through his father complex. Freud is of the opinion that this book is a perfect example of the Oedipus complex. We then looked at what different writers said about Freud. So we had a quick glance into Robert Musil's diaries, also Thomas Mann's essay that is called Freud's Position in the History of Modern Thought, and Wittgenstein, who apparently had a lot of beef with Freud. He criticized Freud a lot for not being scientific or objective and for just being overly sexual. So Wittgenstein's diaries, I think they're called private notebooks, were part of the course, and very important, his lectures and conversations on aesthetics, psychology, and religious belief. Other sources for this course include Pierre Béat's How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read, Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities, Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, Montaigne's essays, and Lost Illusions by Honoré de Balzac. And when I mean sources for this course, again, mostly it was just some quotes, some pages here and there. We weren't required to read any of these books entirely. I think Pierre Béat's book, How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read, I think we read the first 3 chapters or something. But just seeing this list makes me realize once again how many books there are that I want to read, and that I cannot wait to get into. I have started The Name of the Rose recently though, and I'm really enjoying it. Anyways, we also talked about Susan Sontag's essay Against Interpretation, as well as A Letter to Borges, The Pornographic Imagination, and On Style. Susan Sontag, an interesting thinker. She was definitely a big topic in this course, so we also looked at Daniel Schreiber's biography of Susan Sontag. More readings for this course were What is Enlightenment by Immanuel Kant. Now follow quite some texts by Theodor W. Adorno. First of all, Dialectic of Enlightenment, followed by Cultural Criticism and Society, Minima Moralia, one called Dissonanzen, Einleitung in die Musiksoziologie. I haven't found a translation of that one. Negative Dialectics, and an essay called Essay as Form. So this is a 13-page essay by Adorno about essays. If you're into essays, I can highly recommend it. I'll read you a little quote of it. The essay, however, does not let its domain be prescribed for it. Instead of accomplishing something scientifically or creating something artistically, its efforts reflect the leisure of a childlike person who has no qualms about taking his interpretation from what others have done before him. The essay reflects what is loved and hated, instead of presenting the mind as creation ex nihilo on the moral of an unrestrained work ethic. Luck and play are essential to it. It starts not with Adam and Eve, but with what it wants to talk about. It says what occurs to it in that context and stops when it feels finished, rather than when there is nothing to say. Hence it is classified a trivial endeavor. Its concepts are not derived from a first principle, nor do they fill out to become ultimate principles. Its interpretations are not philologically definitive and conscientious. In principle, they are over-interpretations, according to that mechanized verdict of the vigilant intellect that hires out to stupidity as a watchdog against the mind. Another big focus of the course was Bertolt Brecht's The 5 Difficulties When Writing the Truth. I would love to make a separate video about this one. Different works by Slavoj Žižek, amongst which Thou Shalt Love Thy Symptom as Thyself. This is a German documentary, I think. The Plague of Fantasies, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Lacan but Were Afraid to Ask Hitchcock, and In Defense of Lost Causes. We also watched part of 2 movies with Slavoj Žižek, A Pervert's Guide to Ideology, as well as A Pervert's Guide to Cinema. We looked at Edgar Allan Poe's essay Philosophy of Composition, where he tries to argue that there is a sort of logic in poetry, or in his poetry, that you just need to understand in order to write well. He says that, quote, most writers, poets in especial, prefer having it understood that they compose by a species of fine frenzies, an ecstatic intuition, and would positively shudder at letting the public take a peep behind the scenes, at the wheels and pinions. And of course, the way he words things here, a fine frenzy, is an allusion to Shakespeare, because almost at the end, I think, of A Midsummer Night's Dream, there is this expression of fine frenzy, and it's just, I'm gonna read it to you too, because to me it's one of the most beautiful lines that I have read by Shakespeare so far. So here it goes. The poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. More Edgar Allan Poe included his short story The Black Cat, And we also looked at Elizabeth Bronfen's Over Her Dead Body, Death, Femininity, and the Aesthetics. More reading for this course was Nietzsche's On Truth and Lies in an Extramoral Sense. And when we talked about structuralism and post-structuralism, of course, Ferdinand de Saussure's course in general linguistics, Roman Jakobson's Linguistics and Poetics, Roland Barthes From Word to Text, Roland Barthes The Pleasure of the Text, Derrida's Dissemination, as well as Grammatology, Margins of Philosophy, and Plato's Pharmacy. And a few last sources were Plato's Phaedros, Rousseau's Confessions, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, and The Resistance to Theory by Paul de Man. So we've come to the end of the first course. Again, my interaction with these texts has varied from maybe just an idea and a quote taken from it, all the way to reading several pages or chapters, but we weren't required to read any of these books in its entirety. My next course was actually a seminar, which just means that it was a little bit of a smaller and more interactive group and class, and it was on the spectres of postmodern writing, where we were made familiar with postmodernism in literature. Where does it come from? What are the main thoughts behind it? What are its characteristics? What is the philosophy that supports it? How to recognize it? Things like that. And we focused a lot on Thomas Bernhard because he is just a perfect author for representing the transition from modern to postmodern literature. So we looked at quotes from his books Walking, Woodcutters, Extinction, and Old Masters, a comedy. I'll read you a little quote from that one. Art altogether is nothing but a survival skill. We should never lose sight of this fact. It is, time and again, just an attempt that seems touching even to our intellect, to cope with this world and its revolting aspects, which, as we know, is invariably possible only by resorting to lies and falsehoods, to hypocrisy and self-deception, Rieger said. These pictures are full of lies and falsehood and full of hypocrisy and self-deception. There is nothing else in them if we disregard their often inspired artistry. All these pictures, moreover, are an expression of man's absolute helplessness in coping with himself and with what surrounds him all his life. That is what all these pictures express, this helplessness, which, on the one hand, embarrasses the intellect, and on the other hand, bewilders the same intellect and moves it to tears, Rieger said. So this is from Old Masters, a comedy. To illuminate postmodern thought, we also looked at Jean-François Lyotard's La Condition Postmoderne. I think it's translated as the postmodern condition. Quotes from Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. And when it comes to language, Wittgenstein famously said that to imagine a language means to imagine a form of life, as well as philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. So definitely an important player there. We also looked at Wolfgang Müller-Funks Die Kultur und ihre Narrative. From this one, again, we just plucked a quote and discussed it in class. We also looked at some quotes by Robert Musil's Man Without Qualities and the postmodern condition that is sort of already present in there, just as well as in Alfred Döblin's Berlin Alexanderplatz. We further looked at Frederick Jameson's Postmodernism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism, as well as Leslie Fiedler's Cross the Border, Close the Gap. Then we discussed an interesting quote by Stanley Fish from his text Don't Blame Nietzsche for Donald Trump. The quote goes as follows: "What postmodernism says is that while the material world certainly exists and is prior to our description of it, we only have access to it through those descriptions. That is, we do not know the world directly as a matter of simple and unmediated perception. Rather, we know it as the vocabularies at our disposal deliver it to us. The philosopher Richard Rorty put it this way: the world is out there, but descriptions of the world are not. The world does not come equipped with its own language, its own directions, for stating the truth about it. If it did, we could just speak that language and be confident that what we said was objectively true." We also read an excerpt of Hugo von Hofmannsthal's A Letter. We also read small parts of Rüdiger Görner's Den Fenstersturz in der Tasche, Thomas Bernhardts Idee von Weltbezug, W.G. Sebwald's A Poem of an Invisible Subject, a newspaper article by Andreas Schäfer called Sein Schreibstil war ein Virus about Thomas Bernhard, and we just glanced over a bunch of authors that have taken Thomas Bernhard as a literary figure and put him into their own writings. Very interesting. And we took a little look at William Gaddis's Agape Agape, where he's accusing Bernhard of stealing his thoughts and what he wanted to write before he had a chance to do that himself. And then, as a main part of this course, we got a list of 12 or so different books that were written roughly within the past 25 years. And we had to choose one of them to read entirely and do a presentation about. So I chose I Hate Fiction by Tim Shaner with a colleague of mine, and we did our presentation on this book, compared it with Bernhard, looked at, the Thomas Bernhard influence in it, and I'm also going to have to write a little scientific paper about it. So I went very deep with, again, Tim Shaner's I Hate Fiction, as well as Thomas Bernhard's Beton or Concrete, which has sort of worked as an inspiration for Tim Shaner. But anyways, my other colleagues have chosen different books, obviously, so I'm just gonna give you the list of works that we could choose from. So there is Julia Trompeter's Die Mittlerin, Adam Erich Sachs' The Organs of Sense, Roberto Bolaño's Nocturno de Chile, Mario Levrero La Novella Luminosa, Mario Javier Cardenas Aphasia, Ryan Ruby's The Zero and the One, Mieko Kanai Mild Vertigo, Lily King's Writers and Lovers, Lucy Allman's Ducks Newburyport, Lars Ivers' Spurious, Tom McCarthy's Satin Island, and Elias Hirschel's Content. Now, this wasn't a reading assignment, but I read Hero Square by Thomas Bernhard during this time that I was attending these lectures, because I just thought I should catch up with his writing a little bit. I've never read him before, so yeah. Now, there were also a few secondary texts that we had to prepare for class. So usually they were pretty long, actually. Like between 40 and 60 pages or something, and we had to read one of them every week for the first half or so of the courses, and they were just meant to give us the real theoretical background on postmodern literature. So again, we had to read those, we had to write a protocol about it, and then we discussed it in class. And those texts were Lars Ivers' Nude in Your Hot Tub, Facing the Abyss, a literary manifesto after the end of literature and manifestos. Bran Nichols' The Cambridge Introduction to Postmodern Fiction, Jörg Helbig's Intertextualität und Markierung, Postmodern Plagiarisms, Cultural Agenda and Aesthetic Strategies of Appropriating in US American Literature by Miriam Horn, and 2 chapters of Supplanting the Postmodern, an anthology of writings on the arts and culture of the early 21st century, a collection of texts that is published by David Rudrum. We also read Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, a short story by Jorge Luis Borges. You can find that in his short story collection Fictions, and I have an entire video about this short story. We actually read it in class because I wanted to. I was like, can we maybe please? And then we did. And I think everyone else didn't like it as much as I did. Well, anyways. And then some last resources for this course were Renate Lachmanns Gedächtnis und Literatur, Intertextualität in der russischen Moderne, The Barshi, Arathar's Literature, Narrativity and Composition in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad, as well as Platon's Aeon. We looked at those texts when it came to the concept of authorship and whether an author is inspired by a muse or whether authorship is something like a craft that you can learn. Again, there's more on that in the Borges video. I talked about all that. Roland Barthes's Death of the Author, Word, Dialogue and Novel by Julia Kristeva, Schöra Genet's Palimpsest, Albert Meyers Literaturwissenschaft nach der Postmoderne, and some writings by Jacques Derrida. Moving on to my language course, I learned Norwegian last semester. I learned the basics. I should be at level A2 at the moment. And this was just a very basic language course. I again have some videos about my process of learning Norwegian, speaking Norwegian, all that, if you want to check that out. But this was a very standard university language course, not necessarily connected to literature, and because we were just learning the language, there was no required reading as in the form of a book. You know, we had to maybe read small articles about someone doing shopping somewhere or the weather and then answer some questions, but there was no literature in this course. However, I myself got some books that I could leaf through because I love reading, and that's a big part of why I want to learn a language. So I got myself some secondhand books, and when I was in Trondheim recently, I also got myself some more Norwegian books. This Håkan Nessa crime novel Hunger or Sult by Knud Hamsun, which is originally in Norwegian, and I have already read it in English. Again, I have a video about that. I feel like I'm constantly saying that, but it's true. And Karl Ove Knausgaard's Min Kamp. So, those were by no means required reading, but I just liked having it on hand because, I don't know, literature is just the main way that I connect to languages, and yeah, I just thought I would throw it in here, even though we weren't really required to read anything. It still helped me, and it honestly just motivated me to learn the language. My next course was on thematology. Now, thematology is a term that describes the research of themes and contents in literature. So if we're disregarding style and genre for a moment, there are certain matters then that sort of come back more than others in literature. So it deals with the question of how literature and the world go together, how they overlap, and where they influence each other. For example, in the 50s, there was a visible trend in literature towards the topic of nuclear fission. Or in the 2010s, as you might remember, there was a lot of literature around the questions of gender, migration, identity, and globalization. So those themes dominated literature. And if you do research on that, you do thematic research or research in thematology. So this was what this course was about, how that field even came to be, who were the first people that had the thought of like, I've read that here and then I've read a similar theme over there. Do they know of each other? Is there a pattern here? And one big topic in the course were libraries. So again, we looked at how these themes and these topics of libraries, of books, were and are being dealt with in literature. And for the library texts, we looked at, of course, Borges's The Library of Babel, Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities, Jonathan Swift's The Battle of the Books, Arno Schmidt's Meine Bibliothek, and The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. I don't think he's French, sorry for the French pronunciation. Carlos Ruiz Zafón. I don't know. I don't know how to speak Spanish. I'm sorry. So in this course, more than in all the others, my professor really emphasized the fact that those texts are not a required reading. He's just gonna put all of those online for us to look at now or any time in the future if we want to do further research on it. So I don't want you to be overwhelmed by the list of resources. It's really optional, especially in this case, and not all of these texts are prüfungsrelevant. I love how when I script these videos and I get towards the end, I just get so tired and I cannot remember certain words in English, so I just write them down in German. And in that moment I'm thinking, well, tomorrow when I'm filming, I'm sure I'll remember the English word. And sometimes that works, but most of the time I'm just also tired at the end of filming the video. I don't have enough brain capacity to come up with the right English word, so then I'm like, oh no, I'm just gonna put it in while editing. But then also I'm editing and it's getting towards the end of the video and I'm also tired. I'm just pushing the problem further and further. Prüfungsrelevant? Anyone? Not relevant for the exam. I love how professional my videos are, that like all my problems just compound towards the end and my videos just get exponentially worse. So, thank you for still being here. Okay, we also looked at how to systematize knowledge, how you would order things in a library, but also in life, just knowledge in general, whether you approach that in an encyclopedic way or alphabetically, by numbers, by categories, hierarchically, etc. And again, Borges played a lot with this concept, right, of how to sort things, what kind of problems come up with that. So we looked at some Borges short stories again. And then there was a bunch of secondary or supportive reading for this course that was just written by my professor. It's thematology is his thing, so naturally he has written many articles, even books about it. So I'm just gonna put a screenshot up here on the screen by all the texts of Achim Hölter that we could read. I'm pretty sure though that they're not translated to English. Just a few last sources for this course: The Atlas of Literature by Malcolm Bradbury, and two texts where the soul of the human was represented as a little gray mouse, and we talked about the symbol of mice in literature. Those two texts were Arno Schmidt's Kleine graue Maus and Ludwig Tieck's Vittoria a Corombona. Now, the last course, we're almost there. The colonial past and post-colonial present of the Low Countries reflected in literature. So in this course, we learned about the colonial history of the Netherlands and how it is reflected in literature. And usually each week we had one primary literary text that highlighted a certain period in the colonial past that we had to read, and I'll give you that list of primary texts in a moment, but we usually had to read a few chapters, anywhere between 20 and 50 pages or so, and then we also had to read 2 or so supportive secondary texts that try to explain the historical time around that period. Does that make sense? I actually have a couple of very in-depth videos about this entire topic. I'll link it here if you're interested in the history of colonialism and you want to learn more. That's all over there. I'm not going to go in depth here. I'm just going to give you the list of readings. So the primary literary sources were Helle Hase's The Tea Lords, Helle Hase's Uruk, or The Black Lake in English, Louis Coupernic's The Hidden Forest, Jeroen Brouwer's Sunken Red, Marion Bloem, De Leugen van de Kakatoe. I think there's no English translation. Frank Westermann's Een Woord. I also didn't find an English translation. Anton de Kom, We Slaves of Suriname. I actually have that here. This is extremely challenging to read. Such a horrible account of slavery in Suriname. If you're interested in this topic, this is really the one you should read. We had to read a few chapters of it, and I remember that as being one of the most gut-wrenching things I had to do last year, was to get through these descriptions. It's really quite horrible. And the other 2 primary sources were Anaïl Ramdas's Madame Bovary and Raoul de Jong's Jaguar Man. The last one is a relatively recent publication, and the translator, I think her name is Lotte Hammond, she was in our lectures and told us about the process of translating this book from Dutch to German, and her work with the author. That was really nice because she's also a graduate of the university that I go to, and yeah, just really interesting to hear what the actual life of a translator is like. And then for secondary reading, we looked at White Innocence, Paradoxes of Colonialism and Race by Gloria Wekker, From Colonial Past to Post-Colonial Present by Geert Oosterlinde, The World and the Netherlands, A Global History from a Dutch Perspective, edited by Marjolein 't Hart and others, Cultural Memory and Indo-Dutch Identity Formations by Pamela Patiyama, On the Cultural Politics of Representing Dutch Moluccans at the Barrack 1B in the Netherlands by Hamza Moutsaini, 20th Century Suriname by Roosmarijn Hoefde, Creole Hegemony in Caribbean Societies, The Case of Suriname, Ruben Govrichan, and Creole Drum by Verhoeven and Lichtveld, as well as The Netherlands, A Small Country with Empirical Ambitions by Kaptein and Jones. So, that is it. Thank you so much for watching this video. Again, if you're getting something out of it, please consider supporting the channel by subscribing, by liking this video, and by checking out my Ko-fi account. And I will otherwise see you again very soon in the next video. Bye bye.